access our YouTube channel, and once that is done, we can start. Ma'am, we'll just wait for one more minute. Let me just get an update from Shelby.
Okay, sure. All right.
Okay, ma'am. The live stream has already started, so if someone wants to join in from there, they can also join.
Okay, great.
Good afternoon to one and all present here. I, on behalf of Women's Studies Centre, would like to welcome you all for a session Meet the Poet Hansika Jethnani in conversation with Miss Kashish Dua. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our speaker for the day, Hansika Jethnani. She is a poet and visual artist based between London and Mumbai. She often feels like a pink cloud. She writes about themes such as colonialism, migration, shame. She has learned to carry a shame she is learning to unlearn, her fatness, her queerness, and her mental bauble. Some of her prominent works include Mouthful of Marigolds and Ado to My Body Hair. Her work has previously appeared in Young Ignorance, Webzine, Much Stories, Much Stories, and Shy Copy Literary Journal. She's also a contributor to two anthologies, Love as We Know It, Deadly Poetry Slam, and Fearless Love, Mohini Books. She has previously performed at Battersea Arts Centre as part of, of the immersive theatre showing Rallying Cry produced by Apples and Snakes. Members are requested to keep themselves on mute during the course of the session to avoid any disturbances and post their questions and comments in the chat box. Now, I request Ms. Kashish Dua to take over for further proceedings.
Thanks, Jessica. So while yes, Hansika is a poet, Hansika is also a good friend. I met Hansika in 2019 during a literature festival when she was there to discuss her poetry that was published in Fearless Lovely anthology. So Hansika, why don't we begin with some of the poems that you would like to read for us, and then we'll take it forward from there.
Sure. So I'll be sharing 3 poems with all of you today that I think will give you a good idea into the kind of work I like to write about and the topics I like to write about. I'm going to start with a poem titled A Love Letter to My Body I Wish I Read Growing Up. Your flab is beautiful. The roundness of your thickness others have told you to hate. The skin and hair this world tells you to shed. It is to be tended with care. Let light sit with it like daffodils in the wild. Let its flicker enchant the mesmerized skies. Your roundness is soft and beautiful. Its strength like rocks catching crashing waves. It grows more resilience from each slip into the waters. It knows to only grow in beautiful ways. I promise you, your own halves are enough to make you whole. You never need to seek halves in others, halves that you want to be homes. Your roundness is your home. Your roundness makes you whole. Your body isn't missing any pieces. It does not need any fixing. Your body is beautiful. Its beauty slips through shadows as they paint your bed sheets while the sun rises from slumber. Your skin tinkles in its joyous smile. Your body is the sun's playground. Let its gold tinker above your windows. Let it glisten on your skin. Let your body bask in its glory. It is your safe house, your haven while you stride through hurdles, your battleground that blooms with each loss. Your body is beautiful as it is, and it deserves nothing but love. That was the first poem. The second one that I will be reading is titled Mouthful of Marigolds. When I ask my Dada what he remembers of partition, he tells me not much, but there was this beautiful mango tree in Sindh. How generous of a fruit mango must be that he cannot remember a journey packed with bleeding bodies on trains and soil soaked with rage, but he smiles with glee at the thought of a mango tree. The tree must be special, sneaking past buried trauma, climbing out as a fond memory. Maybe that is just how our brains are wired to function. Because if you ask me what I remember about my childhood, I'll say not much. But I love the smell of a fresh crate of Alfonso mangoes in my nanny's house. An anticipated arrival once a week, every summer I spent in Bombay. A sun of its own kind, illuminating lusciously, glazed with freshness. I could never wait to gorge on its sweetness, relish in its juice, slurping, a song to my tongue, rolling in a glorious field of mango trees. I think as a nation, we consume enough mangoes that if we're equated to the amount of empathy needed to stop legacies of violence birthed from partition that are still devouring this nation, we could actually end the oppression. Today, I saw sunset the color of mango. I thought maybe I could swallow the sky whole. That was the second poem. The third and last poem I'll be sharing today is titled Ode to My Body Hair. You grow like a areca palm, my body the seed. Glorious gardens grow on my skin. My body is a wonderland. You are lush black tulips sprouting, prickly grass on a sunny morning. I used to pluck all of your weeds. I wasn't thought to water you, but to split your stem from your roots. My toes dressed with your desire to grow, but I wished you away after Papa said, Eeks, no one will marry you if you have hair on your feet. Yet you stayed, growing into pockets of mini forests all over me. I basked in your loyalty. You showered me with nothing less. As I shed internalized inhibitions, you faithfully bloomed new flowers, bearing sweet tangerines in your buds, burgeoning golden leaves. You flourished. I owe my kingdom of gardens to you. My body is a wonderland, and you are the tallest treetop where I sprawl in awe. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Hansika. Thanks so much. I really like the fact that you chose these three poems out of a lot many more that you've written, because it just gives all of us a glimpse of the kind of themes that you touch upon, from partition to body image to body positivity, body hair, etc. And I was just wondering, maybe we can begin talking about how do you see queerness, feminism, and body positivity? What does it mean to you personally? So if you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I think, those three, topics, notions, ideas, they're all like connected, right? Firstly, and I think we live in a world where like all three of those things, or like to be any of those three things, or to be all three of those things, is kind of deviant to the norm. To be queer, to be a feminist, to be body positive is to challenge like age old stereotypes and traditions and ideas that have been so internalized by like everyone, myself included, right? So embracing my body hair is something that I've actively only been doing for the last 2 years. I've questioned it maybe, for many years previous to that, but I always like felt like I still had to get rid of it even when I didn't want to, again because of these like age old internalized like notions. And yeah, I think on a personal level, all of these three things are quite intrinsic to my identity. I'm queer, I'm a feminist, and I'm body positive. And I think all these three things have very much like shaped me and my work over the last like 5-6 years more than anything. Yeah, I don't know if you have any follow-up questions to that, but yeah.
Yeah, see, your poetry, I feel, I mean, the reason why I thought that would be a great idea to have you here amongst us was because your poetry really resonates with the youth, right? All the young people out there. I mean, this is the kind of work that they really need to read, be familiar with, because there are very few people still out there talking about these things, making, sometimes I feel when poetry or when art becomes very personal, there is also a sense of vulnerability attached to it, right? You're keeping yourself out there for the world to see you through your work. And we need more examples like these. We need more art like this, so that at least the young minds are ushered into these ideas, and they also find other people, other examples in the society who are ready to question these age old notions, as you mentioned, the stereotypes that you mentioned. So yeah, coming to the next thing that I noticed about your poetry, while you were reading it and earlier as well when I read other works, was that your poetry is an emblem of what we call the personal is political, right? A lot of your poetry draws from your conversations with your family, with your grandparents. So do you want to tell us how did family, cultural roots, your history, your ancestry has shaped you into the kind of person that you are, and how has it influenced the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think, it's such an important question, I think, to any artist. But yeah, I think for me, poetry has always been a way of like searching and deciphering and asking questions, whether it's about the world around me or my internal world, or whether it's my roots. And, being like of Sindhi descent, that meant like my grandparents migrated from Sindh when partition happened in 1947 at a very young age. And, literally left everything behind, whatever they had, and started, completely new lives with absolutely nothing. And my uh, paternal grandparents were in Indonesia. And thus, that is, where I was born and raised, many generations, 2 generations later. And yeah, I think I've always been intrigued by that, the idea that like, there was this land, this home that was belonging to, people of Sindhi identity, and then suddenly everyone was just uprooted. Um, and I like growing up, like I used to often think like what would have happened if partition didn't happen then? Like would I have been then born and raised in Sindh, and like what would that have been like? And yeah, I think also the migration of like my ancestors, my grandparents, my great grandparents, you know, whatever they've been through is, and the partition that they witnessed has led me to where I am today, and also led, like, the world we live in today is very much a product of what happened in the past. And I'm very interested in that because I think there's so much to learn from our history and our past. Um, Even, you know, as young people today, like, I think partition is such an important topic that perhaps is not very touched upon in schools, no matter where you've studied, whether it's India, whether it's abroad. And I think also on a personal level, like, I have migrated a lot, my family and I, like, you know, I was born and raised in Indonesia, then we moved to China, and then I moved to London, and now I moved here. So, like, moving around and migration has been a big part of, like, my own history as well. And I think that constant movement has very much, like, led me to be the person who I am today. And, you know, it shaped me as a person, and thus shaped me as a poet. Because my poetry is very much me and, like, who I am and what I've been through. And I think I see, like, my ancestry the same way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's important that you mentioned that we really need to, as young people, as say the third or the fourth generations after partition, we really need to look back at history and learn from it, because clearly, I mean, we do teach a paper on partition to English honors students. That's in the third year. So when we usually discuss partition, or when we happen to read stories by, say, Manto and the others, we do bring up the themes of partition in other first year classrooms as well. And we keep questioning the very idea whether we see partition as an event or as a process. And what we see around ourselves is clearly telling us that partition has been definitely a process, because its effects, its consequences are never ending. We can still see, you know, I mean, in terms of hatred, in terms of Islamophobia, in terms of the entire Kashmir issue. So, you know, from one communal divide to the rest that we've been witnessing around us, it almost feels as if, you know, even though we are third generation or fourth generation people after partition, the partition still seems something which has some sort of an immediate effect on us, and also affects us to a great extent. But what I like in your poetry, where you're talking about you know, your conversation with your dada, and how he remembers what it was like, you know, what was life before partition, or what he remembers of partition. I love the complexity in it. I mean, the way that you approach the entire idea, and I'm sure this conversation did take place, and how it really comes forth in your poetry is the positive side. I mean, of course, you talk about how that positivity, what he likes to remember, the fond memories that he has, is has a lot of trauma underneath it that he's trying to deal with by just remembering the good. And then that reminds me of how, I mean, there's this museum in Amritsar, the Partition Museum, and once you take the entire round, once you've seen all the artifacts, etc., the things that they've saved up from that time, the objects that the families donated from the time of the partition, etc., and of course there are some you know, audiovisual elements as well in the museum. Once you end the entire tour, there's this tree, the tree of hope, which sort of tells us that while yes, it's really important to remember the history as it was, of course there was violence, of course there was bloodshed, and migration which was forced to a great extent. Starting afresh was not easy for most people. Loss and grief were huge parts of it. But that tree sort of pushes people to let go of those things, and then sort of move ahead and learn from it. Move ahead and see hope and positivity as something that they're taking back with them. I don't know if you've been to that museum or not, but so I mean, your poetry was reminding me of that, and the very complexity of the fact that when you do talk about partition, is it can you really talk about one thing and not the other? And when you're choosing to categorize your memories of partition, or how you tell about partition, or how you retell what you saw during the partition, how much of the other side is visible even when you choose to compartmentalize what you're thinking, what you're remembering. So yeah, I really love that poem. If you want to comment on that, I mean, take forward the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I have not been to that museum yet. I would love to go one day. I definitely will. I have read Anshul Malhotra's book Remnants though. And I think, yeah, if anyone here is interested in partition, that's a book you should definitely read. I think it gives you like really a very personal insight into partition in a way that, you know, doesn't exist in literature yet. I think she's created something that, yeah, was truly like groundbreaking. And yeah, I think also for me on a personal level, I think like when I started getting very interested in partition around 5, 6 years ago, I've always been intrigued by it, but I think 5, 6 years ago I started to really like try to like read more and like do a lot of research and stuff like that. And what I noticed basically was that there was not much literature around Sindh specifically, because Sindh was not you know, a piece of land that was divided. So I think there's a lot more literature around like Punjab and, you know, Bengal, but there's not so much literature around Sindh. And so for me as well, like now, like I'm very interested in like doing more research and, you know, creating perhaps more work around the topic of Sindh and partition, because I think a lot of people lost a lot, and you know, just because the loss wasn't necessarily bloodshed, because there was no division of land, it doesn't mean there wasn't, you know, pain and grief and loss. There was still so much loss. So yeah, and I absolutely agree with you, Kashish, where you said that it's also possible for like two different, in a way, polar opposite feelings to exist at the same time. Like I think, you know, it's possible to talk about partition and like feel a lot of grief, but it's also possible to feel a bit, you know, a bit of joy, in terms of reminiscing what it was before.
Yeah, when I read partition lit, I mean the fact that fascinates me the most is the sense of nostalgia. Whether we talk about Intizar Hussain, Manto not so much, but primarily, you know, writers like Intizar Hussain who do keep the psychological at the center of their works. I'm not sure how many first years here would have read so much of partition literature, but we are hoping that through this conversation you're getting interested in the topic and you'll be exploring more. Because they're just into the first semester of studying at the university, and as you rightly mentioned, I mean, school doesn't really talk about partition so much, and even if it does, it's only happening through history books, and history only gives you, you know, one kind of perspective, the subjective experiences, the personal trauma, loss, nostalgia, as we mentioned, you know, what it was like before, the syncretic culture. I mean, we hardly find any kind of examples in school books which is talking about the way cultures were blended before the partition, and how it was really the politics of partition that went into standardizing the languages, etc., or trying to keep what was, you know, I mean, trying to keep things separate, trying to give communal color to almost everything. Since I just mentioned language, I mean, this is something that I was also noticing when you were reading your poetry. Few questions. How does the choice of English as a language come to you? I mean, have you written works in some other language that you are more you know, you're fluent in? And I can also see how there are certain words that you retain from other languages, right? You talk about nani, dada. You're not trying to translate it into paternal grandfather or maternal grandmother, etc., etc. So, do you consciously use language in a particular way, or does it come very naturally to you?
I think it's a bit of both. It really depends what I'm writing about. But yeah, I mean, I write in English like all the time. I have attempted writing in Hindi before, but I think it's something I need to explore further as time goes on. Um, and when I have written, like I've done this other series of poems that's about like Sindh and partition and like decolonization. So I was reading this book called Sindh Stories by a Vanished Stories of a Vanished Homeland by Saz Agarwal. Again, like probably one of the very few books that's there on like Sindh and partition. And while I was reading it, like there was just so much like colonialism in the book, you know, like from the kind of clothes we used to wear back then to, you know, the kind of jobs people had and the way roads were built and the way roads were named. It was all based on like the white man, the British white man, and colonialism. So while I was reading it, I was very like interested in kind of unpacking that and seeing it from like a decolonial perspective. So when I wrote some poems in response to like different pages from the book that I read, I used like Sindhi words in it where I could, like I think I used it twice. So yeah, that felt natural, and that also felt like a way of preserving the language, and at the same time, like, you know, decolonizing um, what I was reading, because yeah, there was like this bit that I read that how there was this road that was named after a guy called Jacob, and so it was called Jacob Abad, and I thought that was so strange. But yeah, so I kind of like unpacked that in the poem through also using like the word name in Sindhi is Naam, I think, or Namo. I can't remember now. My Sindhi is not very good. But yeah, like I used like that word and like actually wrote it in Sindhi as well in the piece. So yeah, language in poetry is something I definitely want to experiment further with. But at the moment, English is what comes naturally to me because it is what I know most well. Like yeah.
And then that's fine. I mean, it just goes on to show the many influences on your identity, right? I mean, the way that you're using language, the way that you're crafting your poetry, it just goes on to represent who you really are. So yeah, that's great. So Hansika, I mean, of course, you're a poet. You're also a visual artist. You also manage a business, right? So how do these three different? I mean, you can talk about a business a little as well because I'm not sure the students would be aware of it. So there are these three different platforms, and do you see these three different platforms, giving you some sort of a space for self-expression? Do you see them, how do you see your relationship with these three roles that you're really playing simultaneously? um,
Yeah, I think my poetry and artistry is something like visual artistry is something I've always seen to be as quite like connected. Actually, like they've always been alongside each other. Like, so I studied photography. It was a very fine art photography course. So it was kind of like studying painting, but you know, photography instead. And every time at the end of the term or at the end of a project, whenever you know we had to exhibit our work or critique our work, my series of work always had like poetry alongside it. It was just natural for me to do that. Um, I've always been writing since I was a kid, and I think when I was studying my photography course, I I continued writing, and it kind of merged in a way with my visual artwork. And I think, yeah, like for me, poetry has always been a form of self-expression. It's always been an outlet. It's given me a voice when I felt like I didn't have one from a young age, and I think that's just become intertwined with my visual artwork over the years. The business part. So, for those that don't know, I run a jewelry Banki Maharani, and it's all about like reimagining traditional Indian jewelry. So imagine like a mangtika as with like the skull as the motive, or you know like birds or a butterfly, but like basically really quirky, unique, fun Indian jewelry, South Asian jewelry. So yeah, that is something I never imagined doing. It kind of happened by accident. But yes, I think as a creative person, it feels natural for everything that I do to like embody self-expression. And I do enjoy like experimenting with like, I also feel like fashion is a form of self-expression. And I do enjoy like experimenting with the colors I wear, with playing with like eye colors and stuff like that. So I think for me, like even Funky Marani has become, yeah, like it is very much an avenue of also self-expression. I think, you know, even the pieces of jewelry we choose to wear as individuals on a day-to-day basis or when we are attending something, those are all conscious decisions that are also like, yeah, a way to express ourselves. And yeah, I think, yeah, all of these three things perhaps have become now, you know, very intertwined and part of my identity. Um, but yeah, I'd say being a poet and a visual artist is who I am at my core. Everything else after is just like, it's like, I don't know if secondary is the right word, but it's like other parts of me.
Yeah, and I've also noticed that Funky Maharani, talks about jewelry for everybody. I mean, you've not gendered your jewelry per se. Even the people who are wearing your jewelry, and I mean the photographs that are there on the Insta account and other places, have also been featured in many lists, right? So I also see how queerness is then, becoming a part of your other aspects of your life as well, where you and Funky Maharani are focusing on how jewelry doesn't really need to be gendered. It can be gender neutral. It can be worn by anybody who relates to jewelry or who sees fashion as a form of self-expression, or if it makes them happy.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. Okay. While of course we're continuing the conversation here, if the students have any questions, comments, if your responses to the poetry that Hansika just read out, please do put in your questions and comments in the chat box. We'll be taking them up shortly, and you can also unmute yourself and ask. Right. So the last thing that I was thinking that maybe will be useful for the students to know is that. As a queer person, as a writer, as a visual artist, you've been publishing quite a lot, right? And what kind of a suggestion or advice would you have for a lot of young people who are there on the call who might be starting their journeys as writers, or who want to publish, or who want to put their art on a public platform? So how should they maneuver this very tricky business of getting published? So can you talk about a little about, maybe examples of how Fearless Love happened, or how other things happened, and how does it really work, and how can the students really approach publishers or see how their works can get published?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we actually live currently in a world now that there are more opportunities than ever before, which, yeah, I think is an incredible thing. So the world is literally your oyster. And yeah, I think there are so many like literary journals always looking, you know, for work. Aside from literary journals, there are also so many, you know, zines. There are various kind of organizations as well that share open calls for such opportunities. So there is a page called Art Open Calls. There's a page called Open Call India. These are pages on Instagram. But yeah, I usually also follow like literary journals on Instagram directly, or find out about like open calls for submissions through these first two pages I mentioned. But yeah, I think keeping up with like submission openings for, you know, various journals and various scenes is a really good thing to do. You know, a lot of times there are no themes, so you can submit any work. Sometimes there are themes, so accordingly you can submit your work. Um, Sometimes your work will not land up where you want it to. You will get a lot of rejections. That's very normal. I think rejections, you know, they happen for a reason, and it just means that maybe that piece is not ready yet. It needs to be edited a bit more, or it's just not right for the place you sent it to. And you know, sometimes it's, I think, also okay to self-publish your own work. Like recently, I just self-published a zine called An Affair with Food, and it's filled with like poetry and visual art. And yeah, I think creating that space for yourself sometimes is okay. It's also important because we are living in a world where it's still like a lot of these kind of radical spaces are still just like growing. And sometimes certain topics become too radical for certain journals. So, like, I submitted my poem "Ode to My Body Hair" to so many literary journals and got rejected. Um, and I was a bit surprised, but also not surprised, because I was like, okay, maybe this is like too much for like, because a lot of literary journals, they've been around for years, publishing kind of a certain kind of work. So yeah, like, that's why I also prefer zines, because I think zines are much more they are more experimental and like less having to be in line of a certain way of doing things or saying things. Zines are more free that way. So yeah, I think just keep a lookout for opportunities, whether that's through pages like I said, Open Call India, Art Open Calls, and yeah, I think keep writing, like keep practicing your craft and honing your craft. I think every rejection just makes you a better writer. Um, and yeah, to talk about how Fearless Love happened. So I remember seeing an open call for it on Facebook, I think, but I think my sister saw an open call for it on Instagram and she sent it to me. Um, and then yeah, I saw Mohini Books Facebook page, and then yeah, I just sent in my work. Um, and yeah, I sent like some 4 or 5 poems. So they're like a micro publisher based in Norway. And they wanted to create a anthology that kind of commemorated um, 1 year of decriminalization of homosexuality in India. So they had an open call kind of based on that. And yeah, like one of my poems were selected with suggestions for edits. So sometimes when you submit your work to like anthologies, you will get suggested like edits and stuff from the editor. Most of the time it's up to you whether you want to edit the work or not. Like, only you know what works best in favor of your piece of writing. But really, it depends on the editors as well and the publisher, how they are. But yeah, that happened, and then I think a couple of months later, yeah, the anthology was launched at Rainbow Literature Festival in Delhi, which is where I met Kashish. And yeah, I think even recently, Mohini Books put out another call out. And usually, a lot of publishers that do anthologies, these call outs are open to people worldwide, which I think is also like beautiful and incredible. So yeah, I think keeping an eye out for such opportunities is just, yeah, important. And if this is what you want to do, if you want to see your work somewhere, and yeah, just keep trying, don't give up.
Thanks, Hansika. Just one last thing from my end. I also noticed that you've contributed to children's literature. I don't know. There's a piece that you've written for children, right?
Is it the one for the United Nations Girls
Yes,
Education Initiative?
yes.
Yeah,
So, can you talk about that a little bit?
yeah, sure. So there is an organization called United Nations Girls Education Initiative, under which they have a smaller organization or campaign rather, called Transform Education, and they create educational tools and resources for schools across the world, on various topics surrounding gender, feminism, equality. And they recently created like a zine that's kind of acting as a toolkit or a resource guide for teachers across the world on like like how to navigate like being a teacher to queer kids in a way. And so I have a poem in there that is written more for the students, but also, of course, gives an understanding to teachers as to how to perhaps navigate the conversation or around sexuality, or how to understand sexuality um, of teenagers, of kids from a young age. So yeah, it's the whole zine is available to download and view on the United Nations Girls Education Initiative website. There's a link to it on my Instagram link in bio as well. And yeah, like if you're interested in reading the poem, you can click that link, and also you can see the amazing work of the other artists in the zine.
Okay, all right. Maybe now we can open it to the students' entire platform. So if anyone has anything to say, comment, questions, please feel free to ask.
Ma'am, you can take 1 or 2 minutes and see if someone has any questions.
Jessica, I couldn't hear you properly.
Okay, ma'am. I was saying, we'll just wait for 1 or 2 minutes and see
Yeah,
if
sure.
someone has questions.
Sure, all right. Yeah, no,
Namaste.
yeah,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
Yeah, hi Hansika Di. I actually really loved your, I think this feminism, the ideas of feminism and body positivity, because, these times girls really, really want their body to look a certain way. You know, we are so obsessed with this standards of beauty these days, and we just forget how to love ourselves, self love. And I just loved your poems regarding body hair and body positivity. I mean, I was so amazed. Like, it really inspired me. I just loved it. I really don't have more words to express what I feel right now, but I was really overwhelmed listening to it. And like, kudos to you to go ahead with such topics. And I loved it. That's it.
Thank you so much. That is so, so sweet. And yeah, it means a lot to me. Thank you.
Ma'am, I also have just one question. The way you've been writing about partition, and the way you take pride talking about the ancestry lines, could you, if you're comfortable, maybe could you also share, maybe 1 or 2 stories that you would have heard from your grandparents about partition, how their experience was?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, all my grandparents were really young when it happened. Like, my dada was 7, my dadi was 4, and my nani and nana also similar ages. So, whatever I know from them is like, like broken memories, and also things they have heard from other people. But, like, say with my dada, for example, his father, so my great grandfather, was already working a lot in Indonesia at that time when partition happened. He was actually not in Sindh, so he had to somehow arrange to get my dada like sent to Indonesia as well. Um, and I never quite understood why, but he just came on his own. He didn't come with his mother, so his mother and grandparents stayed in Sindh. And my dada like took a train to Jaipur. He was in a refugee camp in Jaipur for months. While he was in the refugee camp, he got a letter saying that his mother passed away. Um, and yeah, and I just know that it was very difficult for him. He told me that he remembers also not having like enough food, and then somehow he ended up getting on a boat to Singapore. I think from either Bombay or Chennai, I can't remember. And then he was stuck in Singapore for like a month. and then somehow also he ended up from getting also on a ship from Singapore to Indonesia. So it was quite a journey for him. Hence, he doesn't remember so much because he was only 7 and he experienced so much like heaviness and trauma in this journey. And then to learn of his mother's passing while he was on this journey was also a lot. Um, and yeah, my Nana recently told me that he remembers basically him and his sisters, they were put in those like rucksacks, those jute brown rucksacks that we put like aloo, tomato, and all of that in. So yeah, he remembers being packed into those kind of rucksacks and being like hidden in the car just to like get out of Sindh or like get to the train station or something. But there was a point that they were in the car and the kids were hidden in these rucksacks. So yeah, it's I think there's so much that our grandparents have gone through to flee like the devastation of that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Kashish ma'am also said that we need to have more open and honest conversation about partition and, see it as whether it was just, a process or just an event that happened. And even in, I think, school has never really taught us. Being a history student, we are still diving into that process and how the syllabus has been changing over the years. It's very difficult to talk about these conversations. So I think events like these and sessions like these, and poets who talk about partition and share their stories, I think these become very important sources for us to realize and take into account whether it is a process or an event. So yeah. uh, Ma'am, there's a question in the chat box by Vidhi. Any plans for future work? Any projects in mind?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on a couple of zines. I just completed one, like I said, called An Affair with Food. But I'm already working on the second edition of the same zine because, yeah, there's so much that I still did not, so much of my work that is still not in that zine on the topic of like, body positivity, like an eating disorder that I had. And yeah, there's just so much that I've written that I've still not put in the first edition. So I'm already working on the second edition with more pages. And I'm also working on a zine about Sindh. I actually recently completed an essay titled A Motherland I Could Have Known. And it touches the topics that we've been talking about. And it also touches this kind of sense of like loss and grief that our grandparents had, but they never also really expressed because then, their lives became about rebuilding their life and they didn't actually have the time or space to process the trauma that they just went through. So it touches on a lot of different topics. And yeah, again, I submitted that essay to a competition and it didn't get selected for publication. So I was like, you know what, I'm just going to self-publish it myself in the format of a zine with my art alongside it. So yeah, and then thirdly, yeah, there's another zine that I'm also working on being like queer and South Asian and being a woman, because I think because of the patriarchy, like it's like women's sexuality are much more suppressed, and thus being, a queer South Asian woman is a tough space to navigate. And like growing up, I didn't know any queer South Asian woman. The first time I met queer South Asian woman in my life was in university, and I was aged like 18. So yeah, like there's just a lot there for me to like unpack and write about and share about as well. So I'm going to be working on that.
Ma'am, there's another question. Has writing changed the way you look at yourself in any way?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I think it's just made me know myself more, know myself also more deeply. So that has definitely changed the way I look at myself. because writing has allowed me to like get to know, the kind of deepest, darkest parts of myself that perhaps I wouldn't have necessarily explored if like my subconscious didn't go there while I was writing.
Hansika, you mentioned about being queer in South Asian. Can you talk a little more about, how has your experience been as a queer femme woman in London, in Mumbai, in other places that you've stayed? Was it any different? What have been the struggles exactly? Have you found a sense of a community in these places? Yeah.
So I embraced and accepted my queerness only like 4.5 years ago, like when I was 22. And yeah, like there were a lot of people around me, who had accepted it at a much younger age. Perhaps between, sometimes when they were a teenager to like the age of 19. So yeah, and I think for me, part of that was, like I said, I didn't know anyone growing up. So though I had like these thoughts that I might be queer, I didn't know what it meant. And I didn't know, like, I also was too afraid to like explore my sexuality because, like Sindhi communities can be quite orthodox and conservative. So growing up, like I wasn't necessarily encouraged to explore my sexuality. Like the only conversation that ever was had was like, oh, when you're 24, you should get married. So yeah, I think it wasn't the easiest journey accepting my queerness because I also had a lot of internalized homophobia, I think, to work through. But yeah, I think I'm very grateful that I had the opportunity to study in London because I studied in an art school and there were so many queer people there, like so many. And that was the first time I encountered so many queer people. And that really opened, my eyes. And yeah, I'm also grateful that I encountered, like queer Indian women because that like was a very pivotal moment in my journey. And I think within the university space, at least, there definitely was a sense of community because you could join like LGBTQ societies and LGBTQ groups and stuff like that. But having said that, it didn't mean that like on the streets you didn't experience homophobia. And yeah, I think in within Bombay, though there are organizations like Gazy Family and some other spaces as well. But I think Gazy Family is the most known and perhaps biggest one. I think I have actually struggled to find a bit of sense of community within the queer.
Jessica, then should we close the event? If there are no more questions, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I think we can. Maybe we can have a picture and
Okay, okay.
we've already taken a few screenshots, but maybe we can have more. We just have like 3 to 4 faces on screen. Maybe we can have more faces and then have a
Right.
picture.
So let's give them a couple of minutes. If you can please turn on your cameras for a picture. These are the only pictures that you're going to get in the online mode. Yeah, great.
Ma'am, there's a
Yeah,
comment.
Isha has a comment. So Isha says, I completely, I guess, agree with the fact that the queer community can also be very patriarchal. Even in popular media, they always just portray gay men, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's actually true. I mean, Hansika, do you want to say something further or?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I can only hope that as time goes on, more women and people of other genders, are able to tell their stories through, and that these stories will also be portrayed on mainstream media.
Mm, yeah. even in terms of literature, we've only had, I mean, the maximum number of works that I have seen, especially coming from India, have been by gay men, and possibly a few books by trans persons, but very few by queer women.
Yeah,
So yeah, so we can see patriarchy everywhere. Even the pride parades, are primarily dominated by men. Very few women. Delhi Pride Parade and Bombay Pride Parade have still started seeing a lot of women participating in them, queer or allies. And but when you look at the pride parades that are happening in other cities and smaller towns, you still see them dominated by men, because of course patriarchy is working differently. I believe for men and women, it's not as if heteronormativity is acting uniformly on everyone, right? I mean, queer experiences are also so different from each other.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay, so since we have the cameras on, Jessica, if you want to take screenshots.
Yes, ma'am, I just did that.
Okay, you did?
Ma'am, I've taken a screenshot. I'm taking one from my phone as well.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, I've taken a
Okay.
screenshot. Thanks for turning on your camera, at least now. We'll just conclude this. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to Hansika Jethnani for taking out time and talking to us about not just about her experience of partition with all the important and pertinent issues. I would also like to express my gratitude to our convener, Dr. Maya John, and other WSC staff advisors for organizing events like these for us, and especially to Kashish ma'am for bringing to us such a wonderful poet. Last but not the least, I would also like to thank all the members who joined us on a Saturday afternoon despite being an off. And thanks to all the first years for being so enthusiastic in few of the events that we've had. We'll be regrouping soon for other events. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Hansika. Thanks for agreeing to be a part of this. It was wonderful to have you. I'm sure students will be reading up more, following more of your work, and other people who've been doing similar work, and then hopefully they'll get in touch with you as well. Maybe they'll DM you. You'll start receiving DMs on Instagram, or maybe they'll send you emails.
Yeah, please get in touch if you ever have any questions or anything that you think I might be able to answer. I'm happy to help. Thank you so much for having me as well. It has been wonderful.